Welcome to the Independent Learner Podcast. Here we talk honestly about what it means to raise curious, confident learners outside conventional school. Brought to you by Mosaic, we share real conversations, practical ideas, and honest stories from people living learner-led lives every day. Let's dive in. Today, we're talking about unschooling and neurodivergence, not as an abstract idea, but as something lived and practiced. I'm joined today by Krystal Dillard, Executive Director of Natural Creativity, and by Jessica Hoffman, an unschooling parent walking this path with her own family. Together, we're exploring why self-directed learning can be especially supportive for neurodivergent young people, where it genuinely helps, where it can be hard, and what families need to understand as they consider or deepen this approach. Welcome, Krystal and Jessica.
Hey. Hello.
All right, we'll dive in. So let's set some context here. When families first start questioning conventional schooling for a neurodivergent child, what are they usually responding to or feeling in that moment? Jessica, you want to start?
For me, in our experience, we started questioning conventional education with our son Ezzy when he was in kindergarten. It was just kind of he was having trouble socially, behaviorally, and I think it's a common story where a lot of kids have trouble adjusting at first to a new environment like kindergarten, but then it just wasn't getting better. They tried all kinds of things, but at the bottom of it, the source of it, they weren't giving him what he needed. They tried sticker charts and all the stuff that teachers try with kindergartners, and it just wasn't working. And then someone suggested that he might have autism. It was the school psychologist, and from there, we decided to get an evaluation, and indeed he was diagnosed with autism. And we just decided he needed a different environment that was better suited to his neurodivergence and just kind of a more flexible environment for him.
Awesome. And how old is Ezzy now?
Ezzy is 8 now.
Awesome. Krystal, what's your experience with families coming to natural creativity and, living with neurodivergence and the what's showing up for them and what brings them to natural creativity?
I think Jessica's story was classic. I think that's a classic example of the state families are in when they come to us. Often it's that school just did not work. And sometimes that looks like the young person being in distress. Other times it's described as something more gentle where it's the light is going out. Their young person just doesn't seem interested or attached to the things that are going on. And then sometimes it's just downright refusal, just school refusal. The young person is refusing to go because, as Jessica said, their needs are not being met in that environment. And young people react to that in a lot of different ways. So by the time they come to us, they have opened their mind towards finding some other path, recognizing that they might need something different than what school may offer. Oftentimes, they've already started, as Jessica pointed out, they either are on the path to diagnosis, have a diagnosis. Other times, they have not gone that route, but they're just looking for a place that is a soft or safe landing as compared to where they were. And when they see a self-directed education center where young people have autonomy and voice, and they're not being forced to do all the things that they don't want to when they don't want to, then, even if they haven't gone the route of diagnosis, that seems like something that would be a better fit for their young person than their experience in school.
Your perspectives, then, what often gets misunderstood about unschooling, self-directed education when neurodivergence enters the conversation?
Yeah, I can start. There's a lot of layers to that. Sometimes it's that they're not learning at all, that if they're not producing work that is this product based, worksheets or something that can be evaluated in a really, really physical way, then they're not learning. And I think that, there are people who think they're going to be trading off their young person's autonomy for, more conventional ways of learning that their young person won't learn. So that's the first thing that comes to mind. The other thing is that it's going to look one way, that there's one way to do unschooling or self directed education. And so when they come here, they're going to find the one way or the one path. And as Jessica, I'm sure, will share, there is no one way. And with each young person, when you're really listening to them and observing them and being responsive to their needs, then it means that they're going to be forging their own path with you.
Jessica, what would you add to that?
I would add, in the same vein as there's not one way to do unschooling, I would say there's a misconception that there's one way to be autistic, to be neurodivergent. It's not true at all. I mean, the saying is that if you know one autistic person, you know one autistic person. And I think there's a misconception that autistic people need a lot of rigid structure, and that is just not true, especially for our kiddo. He needs kind of a mix of structure and unstructured time, but above all, he needs autonomy, and that's just not available in conventional education. So, yeah, I would say there's a misconception about structure with neurodivergent people, and that it's always what they need, and that's just not true.
This is a perfect segue to my next question, which is what is it about self directed learning that can be particularly supportive for a neurodivergent young person? Krystal?
First thing that comes to mind right off the top is often neurodivergent young people are interest based, often having one or two or three really focused things that they're interested in. And self directed education allows them to actually pursue those things, you know, as much as they would like to. They're not necessarily interrupted. And those learning paths or interests that they have can be used to do, for them to explore many different things, but it isn't the way that it sometimes is in school where it's, time to turn the page or time to go do something else. They're really given that space and autonomy. So that's the first thing that comes to mind.
What comes to mind for you, Jessica?
I think with self-directed learning, it lends itself more to trying to understand each young person as individuals, listening to them, what they like, what they don't like, what they need, what they don't need. Again, it's just not available in conventional schools, and it's been really helpful for us and for Ezzy to be in a place where he can truly be understood and seen and heard. That's really important to him, I know, and it's important to us as well.
Wonderful, wonderful. Jessica, can you share an example of something you've seen work especially well, either with your son or with someone else, in this context of self-direction? Just a moment, like a aha moment?
I mean, one thing that comes to mind for me is Ezzy can get overwhelmed during the day with anything from sound to like, there's a lot of people happening to be at Natural Creativity that day, and it's kind of generally known now by all of the people that Ezzy spends time with at Natural Creativity that his safe space is the library room, and so everyone knows that that's where he is allowed to go whenever he needs to calm down, and I have seen it work. Krystal has seen it work. Ezzy's occupational therapist, who, is allowed to work with him at school, has seen it work. Just 10 minutes in the library by himself works wonders for him, and that's something that he chose on his own, and it's something that he keeps going back to, so, like, everyone knows that that works well for him if he needs a reset.
What a great example. Crystal, as executive director, is there another example maybe that you've seen with other young people, specifically where it just just fits and works?
Well, yeah, I'm actually thinking of Ezzy also. And, you mentioned his support, some of the supports that Ezzy has in place in terms of outside folks with specialties in occupational therapy or play therapy, and them having the ability to come in sort of seamlessly and be a part of the program day and be with Ezzy, either alone, if that's the work they're doing together, or with young people. And so just the openness of the space, the openness of the staff, the way that young people come 1 to 4 days a week, and so not necessarily having all their time being, 5 days doing the same schedule every single time, opens it up so that other forms of support are able to integrate kind of seamlessly. And that's something that I think is special to self-directed education and our environment and the ability to do that.
Awesome. Where do families sometimes struggle, even after choosing unschooling? Crystal?
Well, that part, and this is self-directed education, and families of all kinds of youth, I think, struggle with some of the same things. There might be some particular things, but the first example I have is not feeling confident that the young person is learning enough, is doing enough. So, often we are bringing in whatever our ideas of what education should look like. And for most of us, that means conventional school. And so when we're not seeing a certain amount of, maybe books read or hearing about exactly what they did in the day, it can be really hard to trust that learning path and that the young person is, that those needs are being met academically in terms of their learning and development.
Jessica, I see you nodding. Does that land for you?
Yes, definitely. I'll also say that it's difficult to address the misconceptions that people have about self-directed education and unschooling. I get a lot of questions about, how do you know as he's learning how to read? How do you know he's learning how to do math? All this stuff. And I'm like, I don't know. I'm trying to trust him. And like part of the issue is that he will not perform those things for me or anyone else. I just have to trust that he's learning on his own, which he is, like, we've seen it. And so it's hard to answer questions like that from people who don't really understand what we're doing, like, how do you know he's doing this or that? And there's also a level of misunderstanding can turn into insults or just assuming that, what's going on and the person in it doesn't, like, I think there's a lot of stuff on social media now because unschooling is becoming more and more popular, and you see people saying things like, "If you can't get your kid to school, like, the problem is with you," or, like, "Your child needs to be disciplined," or it's lazy to do homeschooling, unschooling with your kid, like, stuff like that. There's just a lot of misunderstanding about it, which I'm not surprised about, but it is hard to see stuff like that.
A judgment that comes from comparison,
Yes.
right? Yeah, I
Yes,
totally yeah.
exactly.
Are there moments when unschooling doesn't feel easier, but harder, especially early on and especially if the young person is neurodivergent? Jessica, you wanna take that one first?
I mean, for us, at first, like, as he likes things to be fully explained and fleshed out. And it's hard to do that with unschooling because, when we first started this journey, he was like, "Why are we doing this? Like, I'm not going back to school, so what is this, and what does it mean, and what is it gonna look like?" And, when you're starting out, you really don't know what it's going to look like, and you kinda just have to follow this path and trust your young person and work alongside them. I mean, it really is a partnership between you and your young person who's actually doing unschooling, self-directed education. So for us, it was hard to explain why we were doing this and what it would look like because we just really didn't know.
Yeah. I want to answer that. I have two sort of sides of it. I'm thinking about the younger ones when they first come in, and then I'm thinking about them as they get older. So, on the younger side, I find that when a young person stops going to school and now they're coming, let's say, to a self directed education center, 1 to 4 times a week, sometimes especially for neurodivergent young people, if their home is their safe place and their comfort zone, it can become, in some ways, even tougher to get them through that door and to get them used to coming somewhere else when they have been home. So that's something that and it gets better. I mean, they come once they're comfortable, and like Jessica naming the library and understanding that that's the safe place. Like a young person can develop more safe places, including ones at a place like Natural Creativity. But in the beginning, when their only comparison is whatever their school experience was and home, well, then leaving the the house and going to somewhere else, isn't always what they want to be doing. And so in the beginning, it can take a little time for them to get comfortable and used to coming and to make it part of their life. And then on the other side, as I think about older young people and teens especially, parents start to worry about, and again, like these are typical concerns that any parent would have in any learning environment. It's just sometimes it can be exacerbated, or the person thinks that it's because they're doing something different. So they begin to wonder about, what comes next for their young person if they have been self-directed. What does a life look like for them? And so on the other side, those are concerns that parents start to have. And with us, we do have wonderful teen facilitators who are really, you know the young people and know their interests and start to help and support them finding other things that they want to do, not just the things they do at Natural Creativity, to sort of start to work towards what does next look like. But that's certainly something that comes up for parents, particularly of neurodiverse teens.
If I could add to that, I would also say that with an environment like this, whereas, I mean, if your child is having trouble going to public school, you're dealing with latenesses piling up, days off piling up, and then you're dealing with maybe truancy and stuff like that. But with with this self-directed education or unschooling, there's space for the young person to get used to going to this place. Like when we first started, of course, as you didn't want to go. So we adjusted our schedule. And I have to say, I feel very privileged to be able to do that. I have a flexible work schedule where I work remotely, and it's not something that everyone has. So we were able to adjust our schedule. We were able to like go in late if we needed to. And it doesn't matter. And I remember Crystal telling me that as he's comfort and as he's, getting familiar with the space is the most important thing. And it was important that we took as much time as he needed to get used to it. And, there were some tears, there was some major anxiety about it, but because we followed his lead and truly let him get used to the space in his own time, it made all the difference. And now, I mean, we have some difficult mornings, but most days he's happy to go. He has friends, he knows the library is there for him. So yeah, there's that space to really get used to it without worrying about the repercussions of lateness and days off and stuff like that.
What we hear a lot within the Mosaic collective of members is concern and fear from parents that they're not, quote, and I put this in air quotes, doing enough, right? How do you see that fear show up? Crystal, I'll start with you. And what's one thing you wish parents understood sooner?
I see this show up as overscheduling a young person. So, maybe they're going to do this program and another program and several other things. So sometimes they're overscheduling because they're worried that the young person isn't doing enough. And other times it comes off as pressure that they actually put on the young person directly by asking, what things did you do today? And like the constant sort of questioning and needing the young person to show evidence of what they've done and what they're learning. So those are two ways that shows up. What was the other part of the question?
It was really around the fear that they're not doing enough, right?
Yep. Yep.
And how can families work with it rather than against it? That
Yeah.
kind of fear.
Yeah. Well, a lot of it, and I think that this is where having other staff and parents who you can depend on can really come in handy, and being in community with one another. We're getting ready to have our spring family night tomorrow, and there will be a section on supporting neurodiverse youth in the home. And even in our planning of it, we already know that what is most important is that parents get to hear from other parents, because that's another part of it, is that so often people feel isolated. They feel like they're going through it alone. They don't understand, they don't have all the answers. And so some of that really breeds that kind of anxiety, and being able to have community, the community of other families, places like Mosaic that you can go to, and certainly staff members when you attend a self-directed education center, are all places that can kind of help support a family and getting past those moments, because often they are just moments. And then they're able to move to the next thing until a new thing pops up, because we're human.
A human and the power of community. I mean, that
Yep.
really lands. Jessica, does this fear of, quote, not doing enough land for you?
Yes, definitely. I mean, like I said before, there's judgment from people who don't understand what this is and why it's better for our family. Something that helps me move from fear is kind of zooming out of the fear, like letting it be because it's not going anywhere. But zooming out of the fear, and this is like a visual that I actually use with myself, zooming out of the fear and zooming back into Ezzy, because this is why we're doing it, to get to know Ezzy better, to understand him and what he needs. So it's not that I don't let the fear kind of overtake things sometimes, because I definitely have and still do, but something that really helps is to just zoom into Ezzy.
I want to chime in there because your zooming reminded me of something, which is that something that I've gotten to learn and use for myself as an educator, someone who, even prior to my work in self-directed education, I was a teacher, I was a teacher coach. So working with young people over time, is I also try to remember the long view of a person's life, and how, this is a moment. This is a moment of time that this young person is in right now, and it is not the full view. It is a moment. And so zooming out can also be like, I can let this go because this is a longer journey than this one moment.
It feels like a lesson for life in general, Crystal. Um,
Yeah.
for families with a neurodivergent young person just beginning to explore this self-directed, independent learning path, what is one thing you wish they understood sooner? Crystal, I'll start with you.
The first thing for me is just that a diagnosis can be helpful. I think that families are sometimes hesitant to explore, whether that's because of their own fears about, what if this young person comes back with this diagnosis, and so avoiding it from that point of view, or other fears that come with, being afraid that a label in some way is going to limit a young person's capacity, or their journey some kind of way, or is going to mark them in a way that's going to follow them. It has been my experience that when someone gets a diagnosis, it's often the first step to actually understand what that young person needs. And even just, even because as you said, Jessica, there's no one way to be autistic. There's no one way to be neurodiverse in any way. It's like really broad. But those set of traits that come up, set of tools that come up are a starting point for someone to learn what does work for their young person. And I think that's incredibly valuable and useful.
And Jessica, as think of other parents who might be, other families who might be considering this path and your own personal experience, what do you wish you had known sooner?
I wish I had known that I can trust Ezzy to do what needs to be done on his own. He wanted to learn how to read. He didn't tell me that. He didn't tell anyone else that, but he did it. So I wish that I knew that I can trust him. And I would say that to other families thinking about this is, you know, there are supports available, there's community available, around this. And I would echo Krystal and say a diagnosis can be a lot of different things. Again, this is a moment, and as your young person gets to know themselves and to understand themselves, which self-directed education gives them space to do, they can embrace the diagnosis, they can decide there's something else, but in the meantime, a diagnosis like that can really open doors to lots of different support and communities, and yeah, I wish I had known to not put aside the diagnosis, but put aside the diagnosis for Ezzy. We don't have to label Ezzy as autistic because right now he's just Ezzy, and yeah, he's just living his life, and he can choose what he wants to be when he's ready for it.
Love it. I want to pull back something that you both touched on earlier, which are sort of benchmarks, right? How do you think about success or progress when learning doesn't follow conventional benchmarks? They learn X by grade Y. They do, you know. Krista, what does that look like for you, in your work at Natural Creativity?
I just think back to benchmarks and all that I learned about education and how it works. And my experience is that observation and getting to know a young person is some of the most authentic forms of evaluation that there is. And when I think about benchmarks, also, I think about the importance of, again, we were talking about comparison earlier and what happens when we compare, that the progress is really about the individual young person and their personal growth. So seeing who they were when they first started our program and looking for, what has happened since then and supporting the young person also and being able to see their own progress. And I find that that's a far more valuable measurement, is that sort of self development of the one person and how they've developed over time, as opposed to again comparing to others or where other people are at certain ages.
Jessica, benchmarks.
For me, the benchmarks are not important at this moment in time. The most important thing to me is that Ezzy has learned more about himself, and what he needs at home and at Natural Creativity. That's success to me, that he is making friends, he's happy there. And in terms of, these so-called benchmarks, it helps me to know and go back to, again, what with what Krystal said, what I have learned about conventional education, that, for example, the benchmark that kids should be reading by age 5 or kindergarten, it's completely arbitrary. Kids learn to read when they're ready for it. I mean, if you force a kid to learn how to read before they're ready, it's gonna be a struggle and they're not gonna do very well. I've heard stories of kids not learning how to read till they're 10, and then they learn very quickly. I just think more important than benchmarks is knowing how resilient young people are and how it's better for everyone to trust a young person that they will learn what they wanna learn when they wanna learn it.
Krystal?
Yep. Just going back to benchmark because you started talking about reading. I get very fired up about reading. I'm very passionate about literacy. And part of that passion comes from the fact that I was a quote unquote late reader myself. So I didn't learn to read until I was in the second grade. And at that time, I mean, the pressure of that and what it meant being in a public school, I should have been reading, at 5 years old, right? According to everyone. But my path was different than that. I didn't just I wanted to make sure that I didn't take away from the idea of early intervention or any intervention period. Not so much early intervention, but intervention. It is my experience as an educator that there is value to intervention, but it is a matter of I think that because of the way our system shut is shaped and fears that we have around a young person not being able to do a certain thing yet, that often we go in with that intervention too soon. But I 100%, know that when a young person is wanting to do something and wanting to learn something, and they are genuinely struggling with that thing, then that's the perfect time to come in with intervention and support. And, I've known many young people to really unlock so much when they got something like, Wilson intervention or other forms of reading intervention. So I just wanted to add that learning disability is something that comes up for folks. And in a self-directed space, the goal of that is not necessarily to ignore, challenges, but to listen to the young person and to support them with what, either they are asking for explicitly, because as Jessica said, they will tell you they want to learn to read. So either explicitly or their behavior is showing it. So there are times where, a young person is 12 or 13 years old and there's a lack of confidence and wanting to be more competent, and they may not say reading, but as you get to know that young person and realize what they're able to do and not, that those are the kinds of things we might offer a young person at that point. So I didn't want to lose that point because I think that there are times again that self-directed education, unschooling sort of gets this bad rap of we're not taking it seriously, when a young person needs support. And I think it really is just the opposite of that. I think the difference is not rushing in too soon with adult intervention and what we think a young person needs to be doing, as opposed to having that motivation come from them, and the observation and the conversation happening with them and not about them.
It's a great point. What a wonderful point, and a perfect segue to my last question for you both. What gives you the most hope when you look at neurodivergent young people learning on their own terms? Jessica?
I'll go back to the what I said about resilience. I think allowing neurodivergent young people to learn this way, learning on their own terms, kind of naturally breeds resilience. Having a community, knowing that if they wanna know something, there's a way to find it out, and it's a lot more flexible than traditional schooling, conventional schooling. If they wanna know how to do science experiments or learn trigonometry, there's, like, lots of different ways to do that, and I also think it breeds, really good critical thinking skills. They're not being asked to do these worksheets or workbooks or, you know, whatever without knowing why they're doing it. I think there's a trend in conventional education that you're just supposed to do the thing you're being asked to do without asking questions. I think, you know, from what I've learned about conventional education and, kind of unschooling myself, the point of like conventional education is conformity, not asking questions, but self-directed education, kind of allows space for questions and in fact requires you to ask questions, which I think gives me a lot of hope. And, we're not, again, this is a journey. We're not there yet. I don't know what this is going to look like 5 years from now. But I know that we're allowing Ezzy to ask questions about, I try to make him do a page of workbook a day. And he's always like, why do I have to do this? And I like, it's frustrating sometimes, but I welcome the questions and I want him to ask questions like that.
Love it. Krystal, hope.
Young people who genuinely understand some things about themselves and have a sense of self-awareness, know what they want to be doing with their time, all of that gives me hope. I think we're in a time now where, yeah, there's a lot of people who are not necessarily happy with the choices that they have made, and some of that comes because we've been doing what we thought we were supposed to be doing. So Jessica talking about conformity. And so when I see these young people and they're developing their own interests and they're connecting with other people over the things that they're interested in doing, and especially as I see them as teenagers and then some of them graduating, I get to see them really forging their own path. And sometimes it's something more, that someone might see as more conventional, like going to college, but that's fine. It's not judging college, right? It's that this young person has a sense of autonomy over what they want to be doing, and they're pursuing that, not just doing something because it's go with the flow or what I think I'm supposed to be doing, but because this is genuinely what I want to be doing. And I'm inspired watching that. And, I would like to believe that means we have a future of young people who are going to hopefully be able to find more satisfaction and a sense of purpose from their life.
I love it. Beautiful. What a great conversation. Thank you both so much for bringing such honesty and grounded perspective to this space. What stands out for me is there's not a single right way to do this, right? But the importance of listening closely, staying curious, staying flexible, building trust over time, the power of community with our children and with ourselves. For families listening who are questioning school, conventional systems, feeling unsure, or standing at the edge of a different path, I hope this conversation offered reassurance that thriving doesn't require fitting into a system. Sometimes it means choosing a different one entirely. Thank you both so much. Thank you for spending time with the Independent Learner Podcast. If today sparked new ideas or questions, you're not alone. You can find more conversations and support through the Mosaic Collective at mosaic-collective.org. We're glad you're here.
Resonate.